Across Aotearoa New Zealand, questions about competition and market power have moved from the margins to the centre of public life. We see them in conversations about supermarket shelves, power bills, banking, building materials, infrastructure, and the cost of doing business. These are not abstract issues. They shape household choices, business confidence, investment, innovation, and trust. The challenge, of course, is that competition is rarely a simple story. The latest evidence gives us a mixed picture, with some measures suggesting improvement and others suggesting that business dynamism is weakening and that smaller or newer firms may be finding it harder to gain traction. That is precisely why we need conversations like this, not to reach for easy answers, but to ask better questions. And that is very much Juncture's purpose. We proceed from the recognition that capitalism has created extraordinary possibilities, while also producing urgent challenges that no single sector or discipline can solve alone. We treat these as systems issues, not people problems. That means looking carefully at the rules, incentives, relationships, and assumptions that shape outcomes. It also means creating space for rigorous research, critical dialogue, and practical experimentation aimed at fairer and more sustainable futures. Tonight has been designed in that spirit. It is not a session about assigning blame, nor about forcing consensus. We have brought together perspectives from law, economics, regulation, business, consumer experience, and industry practice, because no single lens can focus these challenges on its own. My hope is that we leave tonight with a sharper, shared diagnosis, a more constructive language for talking about market power, and a renewed sense of possibility about what evidence-based, cross-sector conversation can make possible. Thank you to our panelists and to Drew for facilitating, and to all of you for coming to be part of this conversation. I'll now hand over to Dr. Drew Franklin, Senior Lecturer in Marketing, Associate Dean External Engagement, and my fellow Associate Director at Juncture, who will facilitate tonight's session. Thank you.
Kia ora, Billy, and thank you all for being here tonight. As Billy already alluded, you're a big part of this conversation. We have a brilliant panel with us tonight, each bringing a different perspective, indeed, on competition, law, economics, regulation, business, consumer experience, and an industry practice. They may not always agree, but the conversation will be richer for it. And I'll start with Jessica and move down toward her. Jessica Venning-Bryan is the CEO and co-founder of Factor, recently sold. Congratulations, Jessica. You may recognise the name from the news last week, of whom works with utilities in New Zealand, Australia, and the UK to modernise pricing and improve operational efficiency as the energy sector becomes more data-driven and dynamic. She brings a practical energy sector lens to customer-centred design, pricing, and cleaner, smarter systems. Will you please join me in welcoming Jessica? Raj Krishnan joined the Commerce Commission in 2021 after senior leadership roles at the Department of Internal Affairs. His background spans policy, regulation, governance, and stakeholder engagement, and he brings an institutional perspective on how evidence, regulatory settings, and public trust intersect. Please join me in welcoming Raj. Tex Edwards in the middle, Research Director of Monopoly Watch, a public policy group he founded to advance consumer welfare and capital-intensive industries. He's also known for founding 2 Degrees and for work on market structure, challenger investment and competition across telecommunications, supermarkets, building materials, banking, fuel, insurance, and aviation, all critical categories. Thanks so much, Tex. Please join me in welcoming Tex. Our very own Dr. John Land, here at the University of Auckland Law School, Senior Commercial Litigation Barrister and Competition Law Specialist at Bankside Chambers and recently awarded his PhD. Congratulations again, Dr. John Land. He has acted in major New Zealand competition matters, advised across regulated industries and teaches at the University of Auckland Law School. Welcome, John. Please join me. Likewise from the University of Auckland Law School, Professor Jodi Gardner, whose work spans consumer credit, private law, vulnerability, financial hardship and social welfare. Her recent writing on energy hardship argues for targeted social tariffs for low-income consumers and frames electricity access as a basic household necessity. Thank you so much for joining us, Jodi. And finally, to my right, Dr. Eric Crampton, Chief Economist at the New Zealand Initiative. His work applies an economist's lens to policy areas including housing, regulation, infrastructure and competition, with a particular focus on open entry, whether incumbents must constantly look over their shoulders because others can enter, expand, innovate, or win customers. Thanks so much for joining us, Eric. Tonight's dialogue will feature two discussion blocks. The first will ask, what is the current landscape and how did we get here? The second asks, what do we do now and what can we learn from approaches that may be working elsewhere? Juncture exists for exactly this kind of conversation, the space between easy answers and unhelpful complexity, that place of ambiguity, perhaps, where the more useful questions tend to live. So let's get into it. Raj, the Commerce Commission's recent report suggests there is no single simple story about competition in New Zealand. Some things may be improving, but it also looks like newer and smaller businesses are finding it harder to break through. What should we take from that, in your view, and where should we be cautious?
It was the State of Competition report was an economy-wide piece of report, economy-wide piece of research, leveraging the longitudinal business database material and statistics. And really it was the first stake in the ground in terms of what is the state of competition in New Zealand across three areas: concentration, business dynamism and performance. So it's the first data-driven exercise from the Commerce Commission, and it does identify areas where we might want to take a closer look. But no real surprises, really. I think it's what we see in the economy every day. And there are issues in upstream markets, as we'd discussed in that report, and we've got concentrated markets in the financial, insurance, gas, telco, and some of those sectors. Importantly, I think in our hope is that it doesn't start to solve the issues, but it enables some of the conversations like we're having today, which start to get into kind of trying to diagnose what's happening in some of those areas. And there's no one's got a right answer on any of this. It is just kind of different perspectives on it, and it's how we land those, but with the overall goal of kind of driving more competition into the economy. We do need to have more competition in the economy, and that's our goal as the Commerce Commission. So more debate, more diagnosis of the issues, and hopefully we can get to some landing points, both in terms of some of the policy solutions, some of the regulatory issues that happen in the economy. I think in our building market studies and in our groceries market studies that we'd produced, we'd identified regulation as some of the barriers to competitive performance. They're not the only barriers, but they are there as well. So it's multifactored, multi-layered. The report gives a high-level kind of macro view of it, but it doesn't really get into the detail of specific markets, and it wasn't really intended to do that.
Right. What kind of competition problems do you think are hardest to see in that data? Are they some of those more sort of granular issues, you think, or are they, as you suggested, the regulatory environment or the like?
Yeah, I mean, you really need to tease into the specific sectors and into the specific scenarios. So You know, and they take a bit more detail and a bit more work to unpick and unpack, but it's through conversations both within the sectors and dialogue like this that we start to unpick some of those issues, and whether they be what are firms experiencing on the ground when they start to think about entry and expansion. Are there regulatory roadblocks? Are there kind of investment roadblocks? Are there land use issues? Are there data issues and technical issues? All of these things come to play, I guess.
Well, that's very. No, I think I might lean in a little bit on your expertise now, John, to draw from a little bit of what you alluded to, right? So, if I may, from a competition law perspective, your area of expertise, when a new business struggles to enter or grow in a market, and perhaps the regulatory environment is not quite, as kind, perhaps, to put it plainly, how do we tell whether the real barrier is regulation, the behaviour of existing firms, or access to things competitor needs, like Raj noted, from your perspective in commercial law or competition law, rather?
Yeah, well, I think quite often some of the markets that I've come across, it may not necessarily be a regulatory barrier, though Eric will have perhaps a better view of that than I do, but sometimes it can be access to data or essential facilities, which then is necessary for someone to compete downstream, and often the upstream player, and Raj talked about problems with upstream players sometimes, they may be vertically integrated, so they may have a competing business downstream and therefore an incentive perhaps to not be so nice to their downstream competitors, and that can give rise to issues in a number of cases in New Zealand's fairly concentrated markets. So that'd be one of the main issues that I would see in terms of potential restrictions on entry and expansion, which seem to be the largest problem identified in the Commission report, was that dynamism in terms of exit and entry. That seemed to be the biggest issue that was coming out of that report.
What do you think the sweet spot is in terms of the sort of competition law setting, so to speak, so we're not discouraging that sort of innovation or investment, but equally protecting those downstream, and we'll get to Jodi shortly, the downstream, the consumers, all of us.
Well, the sweet spot is there's not just one sweet spot, because I think in some respects the Commerce Act regulates too far. And in some respects we over-regulate industries or franchise and networks, for example, are far too affected by our cartel laws. Enforcement of intellectual property rights, restrictive licensing of IP rights is something that is regulated far too much by our Commerce Act. So there are areas where we're actually harming innovation and pro-competitive conduct through our current settings, while on the other hand, if we're trying to make sure that downstream players get access to data or facilities upstream, that's something that we don't regulate well enough, and probably the Commerce Commission needs some more powers on. So I think it depends on different aspects of our settings as to whether they're too strict or not strict enough.
And I see you want to respond, Eric. So I'll give you a moment. And that's the benefit of being right next to me. But what I might do first,
just jittery, it's all good.
You're just jittery. Oh, that's okay too. But Jodi, may I go to you next, please, and we'll maybe skip ahead or downstream, I should say. A lot of the competition debate, I suppose, certainly much of what we see in reporting and the like, focuses on whether prices are too high or markets are efficient. But you do a lot of work in consumer vulnerability and essential services in particular. So these critical markets, of course, are the ones we're most interested in when it comes to concentrated markets or up and downstream behaviour. What else matters in this whole conversation for people who may not have much real choice? We talk about choice, but is there real choice in some of these essential markets?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that so much of competition law is focused on consumers, and there is the assumption that if you have a government that sets up a functioning competitive system, that consumers will be okay. And I think the cost of living crisis, the soaring poverty rates, the struggles that so many households are experiencing in Aotearoa New Zealand highlight that despite whether or not you think we have a functioning competitive system, competition is not enough to protect those people who are incredibly vulnerable. And there needs to be this constant pressure put on the government to recognise that they have an obligation to provide every household in the country with the social minimum, which is safe housing, affordable electricity, access to groceries, telecommunications, all of these fundamental necessities that we need to live a meaningful life are currently provided through capitalistic structures. And if we really believe that they are human rights and we believe that every household should get access to them, we need to stop thinking about competition law as being the one thing that protects this and being seen as part of the puzzle, but not stopping putting pressure on the government to make sure that they maintain their obligation to ensure a social minimum. Whether that's through subsidies, whether that's through social housing, whether that is through social tariffs, there's a number of different tools that governments can have to ensure that everyone can live an adequate and meaningful life. But too much of the time, governments say, well, we've set up a competition regime and that's competition's role to do, not ours. And I think that takes a focus away from what I think is a real fundamental obligation of every government.
How do you think then we should best think about markets for necessities differently? Is there a different sort of way to think of these, again, these critical or essential markets differently in your view?
Yeah, I look at it through the lens of a social minimum. Like, what do every person and every household need to live an acceptable life in the society that they live in? And that will vary depending on the different societies. But I don't think there's many people that will say households in this country don't deserve access to safe and affordable housing, access to credit facilities, access to electricity. And if we fundamentally believe that they are things that everyone should have access to, then looking at, well, is the market working competitively is not enough. Because let's face it, when you have such high cost of living and high unemployment rates and increasing poverty, even the perfect functioning competitive system will not give everyone what they need. And so it's about reframing the debate to think of competition law as part of it and a very important part of it, but not everything, and not letting the government get off their duties by saying, but that's the role of competition law, because it isn't.
And I know, Jessica, you've done a great deal of work in energy and also in finance, but perhaps if I can lean into that energy, if I could ask a little bit more directly about energy companies. So you work closely with energy companies and utilities. We talk a great deal about market design or competition, perhaps incorrectly, perhaps to Jodi's point. What does that actually look like for ordinary customers when they open their power bill or choose a plan or try to understand their options? What does more customer-centered design look like in your view?
So I'm going to be a bit cheeky and take you back to my first, not my current business, but my first business in energy, which was a electricity retail startup called Flick Electric. Some of you may have even been customers if we're really lucky. So this was 2014, and a group of us had this belief that we could create a fairer energy system if we gave households access to the wholesale market. And at that time, we had a wholesale market in New Zealand that followed pretty normal sort of demand response patterns. So prices on the spot market were quite high in the early morning and in the early evening, when obviously there's a lot of demand for electricity, and then we'd have nice low prices through the middle part of the day and overnight. So if you can make little shifts to your consumption behaviour, you can access cheaper prices. So to launch that, so first of all, we were launching that business into a market where the incumbent retailers had 96% market share. So if anyone in the room is a startup investor, that would have looked like a really stupid investment. Like, I mean, who tries to take on the big incumbents? And there were 5 at the time, there's now 4. So that was, that on paper looked a bit silly. So we're brave enough to do it. We raised some money, but the next hurdle is that you have to post prudential in New Zealand if you want to participate in wholesale markets. So we were raising capital and then having to post prudential, which was more than half of the capital we were raising, just as a ticket to enter and compete in this very non-competitive market. So it's looking like a worse and worse proposition by the minute from a business point of view, right? And so we kind of overcome those hurdles. We've got a whole bunch of our raised capital tied up in prudential, so we can't access it to actually build the business. And then, the next hurdle is that only about 50% of the average power bill is actually the wholesale cost of energy. The other 50% is things like your lines costs, which are a regulated monopoly. So that's another whole we could have another whole Juncture Dialogue about regulated monopolies. And then we have all the other things like levies and taxes, and there's a bunch of stuff. So to get a proposition into market that delivers fundamentally fairer access to the energy system, there are big hurdles, right? Like, it is hard to get into that market and offer something that is better for the customer. Now, we got there. What we were delivering in those first few years were like really monumental savings. So people saving anywhere between sort of 25 and 50% on their power bills. Which is super meaningful. We had people who would ring us every week in tears saying, I've gone from never being able to afford my power bill to suddenly I can afford it, and I can heat my house more, and I can feed my kids a warm meal at night. And I'm getting a bit emotional. So that's what it feels like when, as a consumer, you can access a proposition that gives you access to those essentials that Jodi talks about through a competitive market. But the barrier entry is high. But it does make a meaningful difference. Fast forward 2 years, wholesale markets completely tanked. The proposition then does completely not stack up, particularly for your most vulnerable customers who can't ride the highs and lows of a spot-based system. And we lost customers. We were suddenly delivering really high power bills because there was no demand shifting opportunity. There were more spot price spikes, which left customers really exposed if they were using high volumes of energy during those short half-hour periods. And then ultimately we sold that business, and it was sold again and wound up. So it's gone. And I think it's an indictment on an energy system where, yes, we have competition, but to Jodi's point, competition is not enough. We need different settings to enable better, fairer propositions that enable, first of all, everyday households to participate in a different sort of way, but second of all, to protect those customers who actually need the most protection.
Thanks, Jessica. No, this segues really nicely into what I was going to ask Eric. So I appreciate you being a bit cheeky and recounting that story, because Eric, you've done quite a bit of work on markets at large, and whether entry, and certainly in particular sectors, is genuinely open or not. In your view, where do regulatory or planning systems unintentionally create this market power that we've been hearing about in these different critical sectors?
Well, thanks. That's a lot of fun, and I think it's a good event for this kind of a question, because you guys are all into systems thinking, and often it's never just one bit of regulation on its own. It's the layered messes on top of each other that nobody is really looking at systematically to see what the effects are from the perspective of somebody who is trying to have a go of it, trying to bring a new product to market or just enter an area. So one example, we were talking about building materials earlier. It's hard to look at any of these in isolation. We've got a system where for decades, planning constraints made it really, really hard to build a lot at scale. That meant that construction companies kind of scaled up to that which was allowed by the planning system. And that affects the kind of designs that they're going to be running, the kinds of projects they're going to be undertaking, and whether it will make sense for them to try and access foreign markets for building materials. At the time, you would have to get brand certification for any of the materials that you wanted to use. That's changed a little bit since. Getting a material certified would cost you hundreds to thousands of dollars, and there will be thousands of materials in a building. In principle, if you would have no problem in going to Vancouver and going into a house and thinking, yeah, this is a pretty good house, it's not going to fall over, they already went through their leaky building crisis, they're kind of same as here. In principle, you should be able to just take all the parts that go into building a skyscraper there, bring them here, build the same thing here. Heck, you could even bring a Canadian construction crew, right? If you think that things are just not quite working right here in housing and that people aren't able to have a go at it, so you're talking about rights to things. I was in Christchurch after the earthquakes, and if you take a right to housing seriously, I think that means the right to build housing. We had neighbors who were people were living in the garden shed next door for months, and it was cold. And part of the reason was that the city of Christchurch made it illegal to build a secondary flat within your house, which was like the simplest thing you could do after an earthquake, but it was forbidden by the rules. So a business that would have wanted to set itself up, hey, we will put a second kitchen in to all of, if you got 2 stories and your kids have moved out, we'll turn the bottom spot into a rental unit. Forbidden, couldn't be done, okay? So you get into all of these messes where it would be possible to import a lot of materials, but only if you're really going to do it at scale. It's impossible to do it at scale if cities won't let you build to scale. So all of it compounds into these messes. It started fixing now in Auckland with the unitary plan. You've started seeing things like Simplicity coming in. They're doing neat stuff and getting building costs down. But it does take some of that change in systems thinking. And I really wish that, like one of my dreams for the Commerce Commission is that they use their market powers study in this exact kind of way, where they would look systematically at the areas where they're finding these issues. In the supermarket study in Chapter 6, it was all about some of these barriers to entry. We also saw it a bit in building materials. I would love to see a market study into the market for medical services. There are all kinds of I helped, there's a Massey PhD student who was doing her doctorate on the experience of foreign trained doctors who were trying to provide medical services here. And just the frustration that they were facing from these layered sets of constraints, and nobody is looking systematically across all of them. It's going to be hard to fix without that kind of systems thinking. And I think that the market studies process is a really good way to start getting into that. I'll shut up. There's all kinds of other ones I could get into, but I don't want to hog the mic.
Well, I appreciate that, Eric, but we'll have plenty of opportunity to discuss it at your table shortly. But before we get into that, Tex, if I may, before we get into the conversations at our respective tables, you've done a great deal of work, of course, on challengers and disciplining, perhaps, incumbents or let's put it mildly. What do you think it actually takes for a challenger to discipline an incumbent in one of these markets? I know you're across many, in your view.
Thank you for that question, and thanks for having me here. I am ex-Auckland University. Market power. Answering your question, what it takes to break into this market. You need scale, you need like-for-like infrastructure, and you need access for like-for-like market segment. In capital-intensive businesses, where there's hundreds of millions of dollars of capital, you need you need to quickly go to scale, and you need a like-for-like product basis, and you need a like-for-like infrastructure. And this is why I was so excited with Billy's introduction, because she must have mentioned market power 3 times. And respectfully, I'm sitting next to the Commerce Commission, and it's all about creating market power rules. This is University of Auckland. It's fantastic. I went here. I love this place. But we need to be in the University of Copenhagen, PTO. We need to be in Gothenburg. We need to be in Stockholm. We need to be copying these international market power regimes from these other markets.
We'll get into that too. Thanks, Tex. You segued nicely into the next section already. So, Jodi, if I may, I'll direct this toward you. In terms of consumer vulnerability, when does private responsibility, perhaps the responsibility of ourselves as consumers, become a public problem, presumably the sort of remit of the government or the like. What's your view on that?
I think it depends on both the definitions of individual responsibility and the definitions of vulnerability. Because a lot of people cannot help the vulnerable position that they have put themselves in. And if we as a society really want to have a system that cares about people who are vulnerable, then I don't think you can say vulnerability that has been put on someone by circumstances outside of their control is ever really their own private responsibility. That should be something that the government and society should be able to respond to and have adequate protections in place. If you talk about responsibility of choices, and if they have made choices that have put themselves into a vulnerable position, it's very easy to go down the path of victim blaming. And you see that a lot in the banking industry, and you see that a lot in the credit industry. And I think it's really important to understand that choices need to be meaningful choices. And a lot of people, for example, go into debt or can't pay their electricity bills, and it's not a choice. It's not that they have been irresponsible. It's that they fundamentally do not have the finances to pay for everything. And sometimes the response to that can be to get into loans, to get into high cost credit that they then can't afford to pay back. And it's easy to say, well, they shouldn't have got that loan because it's made them worse off and they should have known that. But again, sometimes a choice of borrowing money to pay your electricity bill and also being able to put food on the table is not a choice that people should have to make. And I don't think that we can say that is a responsibility that they need to take on themselves and not a public obligation. So I think that there is a model there that we need to ensure that the social safety net is not strong enough or wide enough to create a moral hazard. But I also think it's very easy for the government and very easy for people who don't have the lived experiences of the vulnerable households to turn choices that people should never have to make into very easy victim blaming.
Thanks, Jodi. And in the energy sector in particular, Jessica, has there been a particular model or intervention that you've observed that has responded perhaps to this challenge that you've seen work well?
Oh, I think we're yet to see the right answer in energy. I don't know how many people know about prepay energy in the room. That was about the single worst thing that happened to vulnerable consumers because they paid more than the standard power price for it. Like, sure, you get maybe you get some control because you can see when your power's about to run out, but when you're paying 25% more for that power, that's a pretty corrupt moral choice, if you ask me. I'm going to pass it back to Jodi because she's like, yes.
I completely agree about prepaid, and I think one of the most harmful things that prepaid did was take the responsibility away from the electricity companies because they weren't disconnecting people. They were saying people were self-disconnecting. So suddenly the statistics of people who couldn't afford to get electricity anymore looked a lot better for the electricity companies because they weren't the ones shutting people off. But in reality, people were shutting themselves off because they couldn't afford it. So it had the increased costs, but it also had that kind of moralising and victim blaming impact.
Yeah. Can I just add something else to that as well?
We
Sorry.
need 2 mics.
Here, well, I promise we won't do this all night. Last one. But the other thing that when I say I don't think we've got the right solution yet, and possibly people in the room going, but solar and battery, that's going to be amazing. The capital outlay for solar and battery is so far beyond the realms of possibility for a vulnerable household, unless we come up with some sort of system that makes it possible, that we are, I believe, at risk over the next 5 years of creating a whole new divide and inequality between people who can participate in the energy system and people who cannot. And this problem that we're talking about will get worse unless we don't actively address it.
All right, Eric, you've been very gracious. Waiting, we're going to pass it all the way back to you. This is really fun because I'm really glad that the conversation went this way because it's a nice segue.
Just as a starting point, for most economists, protecting the vulnerable means giving poor people money. It doesn't mean forcing businesses to provide different pricing. It doesn't mean Maybe you can have regulation in there, but there are really hard trade-offs, and it's easy to screw things up in ways that wind up hurting the people that you're trying to help. So economists would tend to say, let markets work, try and fix any problems that there actually are in markets, because sometimes there are, but don't try and solve equity and vulnerability issues with market instruments. Try and just give poor people money. Take money from richer people, give it to poor people, and people will vary in how much they think is appropriate for that, but we've all got preferences. As a specific example of how things can go wrong that ties right into this, I've been talking a bit more recently with folks that are really keen on electrifying New Zealand. And they're wondering, like, why is it so hard to get credit to put rooftop solar on? They've run all of the numbers. They can show that somebody who puts rooftop solar on winds up spending at 5.5% interest rate. They spend less on outgoings for the combination of the capital cost and repayments on the solar and what minor bits of electricity they're still purchasing from the market than they were paying for electricity before. So why will nobody lend to them? Like, if you've got an existing mortgage with one of the banks that gives a subsidized loan, well, you can do that. If you've already got a loan with your, already have a mortgage and you've got enough equity, well, you can probably top up your mortgage. But if you're not in one of those spots, you might be screwed. Now, there's a very specific reason for that. I have started looking into it this week, and I am pretty sure this is the reason. I'm not 100% sure, but this is, okay. If a bank is going to lend you money, they are required by the Reserve Bank to have not more than a proportion of their loans at high debt-to-income ratios, okay? The bank gets in trouble with its regulator if it loans you money and it's high relative to your income. It doesn't matter that your outgoings go down. The commercial bank can't care because their regulator doesn't care because their regulations have set rules that are inflexible to the situation. Non-bank lenders are under a different regime that causes the same problem. The Consumer Credit and Finance Act, CCCFA, they're required under responsible lending criteria not to be advancing credit in ways that are considered irresponsible for some of the reasons you talked about, like you don't want loan sharks and whatnot. Okay, non-bank lenders that aren't loan sharks tend not to do those sorts of things. But anyways, one of the outcomes would be if I were a non-bank lender and I wanted to lend to you to put rooftop solar on, even though we were all pretty sure it would reduce your outgoings, if something dumb happened, like you started using your power a lot during peak times and not running it when your solar is running, your lender can get in all kinds of trouble with the FMA for having advanced credit irresponsibly. So they're going to get in trouble with their regulators if they lend you money. So of course we've got this credit problem. And the solution isn't, well, let's come up with some government lending scheme. The solution is let the lenders whose business it is to lend money not get beaten up by their regulators if they do the right thing. It's really easy to screw things up because the CCCFA, that was all to protect vulnerable consumers. And so are the DTI ratios. That is to protect vulnerable people. And they're screwing the people they're trying to help.
All right, well, we'll get into some of the guardrails perhaps in the interventions in the next block. We'll have opportunity to talk a little bit about perhaps what that looks like in practice and perhaps some, again, jurisdictions or constituencies that have done it well in your view. So for the next block, if I may, I want to start with a little bit of a lightning round, so a very perhaps short response, if at all possible, to all of the panelists. So we've talked a little bit about perhaps, and Tex alluded to this already, so perhaps I'll start with you, Tex, with some overseas models and perhaps similar or different sectors. What's one overseas model, sector example, or institutional practice that New Zealand should study seriously, or perhaps could be the subject of that more granular view from the Commerce Commission or the like? Not copy wholesale, but learn from, in your view, and in some of those critical sectors.
Thank you for that question.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Tex.
Let's just take a look at banking. In New Zealand, we have the Banking Cartel Forum, and we have 95% of bank profitability and bank traffic with one system. And as we know in competition, we have what we call network effects. If you can't pay the ANZ and the ANZ can't pay ASB, if you're at Jiggity Pokery Bank and you can't get interconnection, you're outside the system. Let's just take a look at Denmark and the UK for an example, what they did. The UK government got so sick of their Banking Cartel Forum, they levied a windfall tax on the British banks and said, send this windfall tax to the internet-only challenger banks. Has anybody heard of the internet in this room? Have we? Yeah. Well, in New Zealand, we haven't heard of the internet, in Wellington, I'll stand corrected here, because we don't have internet-only banks, point one. Point two, Denmark did challenger internet-only banking so well, they pay 45 basis points over the OCR, LIBOR, the Danish interbank rate. So they pay 45 basis points. Is there anybody in this room who pays 45 basis points over the ACR on their mortgage? I don't think so. ANZ New Zealand, the most profitable savings and loan bank in the OECD, have a net interest margin of 280 basis points. So Denmark's a good example, so is UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Tex. Well, let's go to John then. No, perfect. Pass it along. How about any sort of legal tools or guardrails in that respect that you've observed, again, overseas or in other constituencies that we could learn from?
Yeah, I guess one that I'd be interested in getting the Commerce Commission another power is not necessarily from overseas, but within our own jurisdiction. So the FMA has powers to do stop orders. And I think potentially we could use something like that for the Commerce Commission, stop orders or performance orders in the area of access to data or access to facilities. And rather than requiring the Commission to go to court and get an injunction or a performance order as proposed in the current bill before the House at the moment, is, we'll just make the order ourselves, thank you very much. If you want to challenge that, you go to court to set it aside. But put the onus on the upstream monopolist, and perhaps we might see some more entry and expansion.
Raj, what do you think about that? No pressure. We keep mentioning, the Commerce Commission to solve all these ills, but that's right. Again, in your view, what's that balance? So again, there's guardrails, there's protections, but we don't want to sort of hamper innovation. Is there a balance there somewhere in your view?
Yeah, I think there is a balance, and I think within the Commerce Commission, we obviously administer the laws that Parliament sets. There's an appropriate balance between what is given to the Commerce Commission to administer and what sits with ministers and what sits with Parliament in terms of deciding interventions in markets or whatever. And that those can slide either way, right? But from a Commerce Commission perspective, we are the recipients of the acts and the laws. We will have views about kind of the effectiveness of those things, and we'll make those views known.
No, Tex, can't.
He doesn't have enough power. End of story. It's outrageous. His toolbox is not good enough.
So we are getting more tools, Tex, as you know. One of the things that we have seen work in other jurisdictions is the potential for code-making powers to intervene in particular markets where there is a problem. Now the balance sits of we can undertake work, do an investigation, identify the barriers to competition in markets, but who has the decision rights on implementing the code, and does that sit with the Commission or does that sit with ministers? And these are balancing questions at a political level, but I'll hand to Tex, who can probably give you
my exact submission point was, let's set up a Commerce Commission office in Stockholm, in Brussels and in London. Absolutely. Because Raj is a civil servant. He can't say, this is bad law, this is bad. He'd get fired. I can. I Monopoly watch. And essentially, what is happening here is it's outrageous. Because what the Danish competition can do, what the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority in the UK can do, It's a dream come true for Commerce Commission. They're walking around in handcuffs. I have just come this evening from the Select Committee hearing on the Rebstock review of it's called the ComCom Amendment Act. It was a wet blanket. It was capital P pathetic. It had no, to Billy's comment, no definition of market power. And essentially, we don't have time tonight, thank you, Dr. Drew, but in a perfect world, we'd have what the New Zealand Commerce Commission can do down one side of the slide, and the other slide would what the Danish regulator can do, what the Swedish regulator can do, what Brussels can do, what UK can do. Thank you.
I'd be pretty hesitant about all of that. Yeah, I'll have just a very brief rebuttal, but then something that I would like to see. I worry that European-style competition policy has often tended to protect competitors rather than consumer welfare. It's not been great overall, and if we're worried about dynamism as being an ongoing problem as identified in the ComCom's report, Europe is stagnating and dynamism is near dead there compared to what's going on in the US. It's not good compared to a more American-style antitrust and even New Zealand-style antitrust. One thing that I would like to see in a different approach to overseas, I'd seen one of the questions on Slido was around the size of our market and whether we can really have effective competition. One of the ways that I would like to see it happen is by recognizing unilaterally the standards that are obtained overseas. So rather than making companies jump through New Zealand bespoke hurdles to access a market of 5 million people, we could unilaterally say, you know what, if something is good enough for Canada, would any of you really have trouble if you went to Canada and like bought something and think, oh my God, this is going to be terrible because like Canadian standards, you can't trust them? Like I might worry a little bit about their milk, but anyways, not as good as New Zealand. But in general, it's going to be fine. We are really good about this in automobiles. Instead of having New Zealand-specific regulations on car imports, we say, you know what, if it meets this set of Japanese standards, this set of UK standards, this set of European or American or Chinese standards, they're good enough for New Zealand. All right, we don't do our own thing. If you make companies jump through New Zealand-specific hoops because, oh, it's a great privilege to be able to serve the New Zealand market, we're not worth the hassle for them. We see it particularly in medicines. We are going to fall farther and farther behind in access to front-running pharmaceuticals as the pace of innovation overseas accelerates. We're already seeing it in veterinarian and plant health medicines. All kinds of stuff we're not able to access here because it has to go through our own little bespoke process. We can't afford to reinvent all of those things, and we can't expect overseas companies to jump through weird stuff that we impose. Deciding which other countries' standards are also good enough for here could open up so much competition because you'd no longer have, you wouldn't be restricting things to the companies that felt it worthwhile to jump through our hoops. I think it could do a lot of good.
Before we take a break, I know you're desperate to respond, Tex. But Jodi, is that a pause that I see?
I don't want to get in the way of these two.
But please do.
Okay, no, I might just cool the two gentlemen down. I think my suggestion pushes back gently on something Eric said about the solution to vulnerability and inequality of access is give people more money, don't put the obligations on businesses. And I think in an ideal world, yes, and in an ideal government, yes. But we're not in an ideal world, and I personally think we're definitely not in an ideal government. So that's just not going to happen. And I think if you've got businesses that have a large market share of a crucial service and they're making significant profits from it, they're in a very privileged position. And I strongly believe with that privilege comes responsibility. And I don't think that they should be able to go, we're just here to make as much money as possible, we don't have any obligations. I think that the social dialogue and the social contract in society can push back against that. And there's been many examples where that has been really successful. And it's resulted in the creation of subsidised services and contracts for people who couldn't access them at full price. And the UK has a number of these social tariffs in essential services such as telecommunications and internet the pandemic showed us that everyone needs to be able to access the internet to live as part of the community, just as some of the most vulnerable households were being really struggling financially. And there was a lot of push on telecommunications companies to ensure that everyone could stay connected. And so they created social tariffs for people who were on certain types of benefits, and they agreed, with a little bit of pressure, to provide very subsidised internet and phone contracts to people through social tariffs. And they recognised that because it was a dominant market where there was a handful of people with a huge market share, they could afford to use some of those profits to provide those services to people who could not afford the standard costs. So I think that we can utilise those kinds of systems, and we have a number of industries in this country that have those large market shares and that do make these windfall profits. And we as a society can start to push back and put pressure on them to say, well, with your privilege comes a responsibility, and what you're providing is an essential service. So provide it to people who cannot afford to pay market price for subsidies, and create a better world for us all to live in.
I'm just going to get
final word.
I'm going to get
Tex,
this word
and
out.
then
And I want everybody
then you'll get to discuss further at your
I want
tables.
everybody to write this word down. It's called cognitive surrender. Okay, and what we've heard.
2 words, Steve.
Sorry, beg your pardon. Cognitive surrender is acquiescing to the lobbyists' grooming of you that you're too small for competition. Oh dear me, you're only with 5.5 million people. That's why it's really important we have a Commerce Commission office opening in Gothenburg, in Copenhagen, in Brussels, I'm serious, in London. And we need to look at these other like-for-like economies. Australia isn't going to help us. They're stealing from us. We broke away from Australia in 1901. And cognitive surrender, I won't claim fame to the word, that came from my kids' scout groups, Cub Scouts woodwork group. And a parent came up to me and said, can you anchor the word cognitive surrender? Well, I'm sick of lobbyists, unregistered, unregulated lobbyists controlling the narrative and deferring us to, we're too small for competition. Thank you.
Jessica, are there any examples of industry-led interventions or ideas like dynamic pricing that work well in sectors like energy, or perhaps what's the role of industry in all of this? We've talked a great deal about regulation and law and the like, so where's the industry lever?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and obviously as somebody who's been trying to build companies in energy for too long now, it's something, I still believe that we can get to a place where the industry is delivering better for consumers and businesses and the country overall. I think the difficulty with energy in New Zealand is, if I go back to what I was saying before, about 96% of the market is monopolised by the big four, who kind of fundamentally offer the same products and services. There's not really any real differentiation between them. So if we leave it where it stands, we're not going to get good industry-led change in terms of the products and services that make their way to the end customer. If we want the other 4% of the market to do that, or we want that portion of the market to grow, so we want more new entrant utilities who are offering different products and services, one of the big things we've got to solve is the futures market. So I don't want to get too technical, but basically in New Zealand we don't have a proper futures market. So if you are a participant in the energy market, you can participate in the spot market. So you can pay whatever the spot price is doing, and I'm doing that because that's what it does. But you can't buy a futures contract that allows you surety of your input costs. And if you don't have surety of your input costs, like in any business, it's really hard to design products and services for your customers. In Australia, in the UK, and many other markets all over the world, they have a proper futures market, which means that, and everybody participates in an even-handed way, which means anybody can access those futures contracts at a market price, and then they can design products and services around them. Because we don't have that in New Zealand, what we have instead is you have to go to the generator and negotiate the purchase of that energy from the generator, who typically aren't inclined to give a particularly favourable futures contract to a competing company, lest one that is trying to disrupt the established order. So, you know, I do believe that products and service innovation is excellent for markets, and it's how we make great progress. But in order for that to be possible, you have to have equal access to input costs of supply so that everyone's playing on the same playing field. So I think it's, yes, there's a role, but you've also got to level the playing field first.
Well, perhaps to that point, John, what is, or how can competition law perhaps contribute to that levelling of the playing field in your view? What are some of those levers that need to be pulled?
Well, I think that there are a number of improvements that could be made to the Commerce Act to improve our settings. I mean, I could go on about a whole raft of things, but I talked before about franchising. I think our Commerce Act is terrible when it applies to franchising. The cartel laws stop franchising as a normal alternative means of business operation from working as effectively as it should do. The impact of our laws on IP, bad as well in terms of trying to enforce your IP rights, trying to settle a dispute relating to IP rights can give rise to real issues under our cartel laws, and it's just crazy. So there's a large number of things that we could do to improve our settings to create a more pro-competitive marketplace, and a number of those actually would be to remove some of the restrictions actually in our Commerce Act. We've got further changes that are being proposed in the current bill which will diminish innovation as well, change to the substantial lessening of competition test proposed for section 27 and 36, which will have a situation, if you're a dominant firm and you introduce a new innovative product, all of a sudden that could potentially be considered to be a breach of section 36 because you're entrenching your market power. How crazy is that? You introduce an innovative new product and all of a sudden you're breaching our Commerce Act. So there are changes that we could make, and there are also changes that we shouldn't make that are being proposed.
You've gotten some applause over here from Eric, John. So did you have a quick response to that?
No, love that, and I also agree there's some problems in how they're changing the predatory pricing settings as well. And yeah, one new power that I wonder if I might run past you, and you can tell me whether I'm stupid or crazy or maybe I'm onto something. I would love to. I have fun thinking about a new Part 2 restriction on. Part 2 of the Commerce Act is where they say, here are the things that you can't do because these are deemed to be anti-competitive and we're going to beat you up with a big stick if you do any of these things. Set a Part 2 restriction saying that the anti-competitive use of a regulatory system is prohibited. So what I mean there, think about the case of the Wanaka McDonald's that tried to set itself up. The guy that was setting up a strip mall down the road, he lodged an objection to the resource consent there because he wanted to have the McDonald's as a tenant in his development, okay? Now, everybody was fine with that. They were considered to be fine under the Resource Management Act because they're not a competitor with the McDonald's because they're not a restaurant. They're a competitor in the landlord space, all right? I consider that to be an anti-competitive use of a regulatory process. I would love to see that kind of behavior restricted. We've also seen it in Auckland where, for example, a proposal to do up a heritage building got opposed by a guy whose main business is in doing up heritage building and seems to want to be the only one allowed to do it. Sorry, I want to be careful not to defame anybody. It felt like sharply anti-competitive use of a regulatory process. I would love to see a Part 2 restriction on that.
If I may, Tex, I'll ask you to close us out before we finish.
We need to benchmark these competition law issues against our international peer group. Competition law isn't perfect, it needs to be practical. The challenge before us as a society is to fix some of these deeply broken markets and capital-intensive industries. And I'll just share a catalogue, a specific event which I was deeply traumatised when I was in the telecommunications industry. We had the CEO of the dominant monopolist tell us, not that she did say that they used confusion as a marketing tool, but she actually came out and canvassed at an investor conference that if you have market power, you can control whatever new technology comes along. And that was the embryo in that change to Section 36. The challenge for us is to have benchmarks. And as I sign off for the evening, you don't need to listen to Tex Edwards at Monopoly Watch, because the OECD says the same thing. And the OECD 2024 report is a fabulous read for this entire group, and it would be lovely to see it catalogued in at the Auckland University, point one. And then if you get bored with the OECD, go and see what Goldman Sachs says, a very prestigious investment bank in New York. Go and see what Union Bank of Switzerland says, the very prestigious bank in Geneva. And their exact words are, Australasia has a lovely market structure and unprecedentedly high margins. And it discusses that in banks, and it discusses that in supermarkets. God forbid what they think in insurance, aviation, and building materials. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks. Why don't you all please join me in thanking our panellists for tonight.